Okay. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Lisa Coriel. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Modern Psychoanalysis of Philadelphia, formerly PSP. So happy to see everyone this evening. I was looking over the registration list, and we have colleagues joining us from all over the country, some colleagues in Canada, someone from France. So welcome all. Thrilled to see you all. Let's see, just a reminder to keep yourself muted during the presentation. Dr. Friedman will be asking, we'll be setting aside a period for questions after his presentation. There'll be plenty of time to ask questions. Also, I encourage you to leave your screen on. If you're seeking CEs, our accreditor requires that a person be on screen during the presentation. I think that's all the nuts and bolts. And if you're seeking CEs, those will be distributed just to be generous by next week, hopefully before that, but you'll definitely get them in email using the email that you registered with. So let me introduce our presenter, Dr. Friedman, Richard Friedman. We welcome him back. He joined us last year for a presentation on charisma, which was very thought-provoking. We have a recording of that video on our website and on our YouTube channel. I encourage you to check it out. Dr. Friedman is a graduate from the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies, the second class, 1978. He taught for many years at 4 psychoanalytic institutes. He's published articles in several journals, including 2 papers in modern psychoanalysis, many book reviews, and chapters in 3 books. After spending over half a century learning to be an analyst, Dr. Friedman enjoys giving back to the profession through supervision of candidates. So please welcome Dr. Friedman.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank a few people who have made helpful suggestions for this evening's presentation. Some of you might know them or know of them. Jack Kerman, Nicole Kerman, Alan McLeod, Josie Oppenheim, and Barbara Smith. I also want to thank IMPP for inviting me to present, especially Ray Gurley, Lisa Coriel, and Priscilla Bright, all of whom made the arrangements for this webinar painless for me, and I'm very grateful to you for that. I've been involved in other things where it's not quite so smooth. You've done a great job. Thank you. I'll speak for about half an hour, and then I look forward to having a conversation with all of you. Hyman Spotnitz, when I was in supervision with him, frequently would say nothing or almost nothing for most of our sessions, even if I were to ask him a question. His most common response to one of my questions would be to tell me to just continue the process presentation. Just keep talking, he would tell me. Toward the end of the session, he would almost always say, in exactly the same words, just keep them talking. When I'd ask for further guidance on how to achieve this, he would sidestep my request. Perhaps I developed a technique I'm going to talk about this evening out of frustration with Spotnitz, just as Spotnitz intended. But both then and now, I feel this is a charitable reading of Spotnitz's technique. What I did learn from Spotnitz, and the main reason I still identify as a modern analyst, was his insistence that the analyst's task is to help their analysands say everything. Spotnitz's single-minded focus on analysand speech is based on Freud's posthumously published manuscript from 1895, Project for Scientific Psychology, which, by the way, now has considerable confirmation by modern neurologists and MRI scans, things like that. Freud really hit a home run with that, but he was embarrassed to publish it in his lifetime because it just seemed like science fiction to him when he was proposing. He thought it would be mocked. In his paper, Freud discussed the tendency people have toward what he called repetition compulsions. He believed, although he could not prove, that in reaction to a stimulus, people's responses as adults follow neuronal pathways formed early in life. This happens without conscious awareness. What was revolutionary in Freud's formulation was his thought that adults can still form new neuronal pathways through the right kind of talk, the kind of uncensored, freely associated speech that is encouraged during a psychoanalytic session. His idea was that in the course of freely associating in a relationship with their analyst, feelings that had been unconscious will become conscious, and that with consciousness comes liberation from repetition compulsion, what cures people, although I think it more accurate to characterize this as saying what helps people achieve free will, is not what the analyst says. It's what the analysand says. That doesn't mean that the analyst's words are unimportant, but the analyst's verbal interventions are catalysts to help analysands overcome both their conscious and unconscious resistances to saying everything. Freud's formulation of a dynamic between talk and change is the foundation for everything I think important about psychoanalysis as a balm for troubled souls. And basically, that's the theme of tonight. I'm not speaking about analytic theory. I'm talking about technique and what happens during the session, why people go into analysis, not why people become analysts because they fall in love with psychoanalytic theory. So this evening, I'll focus on analyst tools to help their analysands talk. In lecture 19 of his 1916-1917 introductory lectures, Freud described a remarkable and counterintuitive phenomenon. People came to him as they come to us, in great pain. He instructed these people, as we instruct the people who come to us, to speak freely without self-censorship, and that doing so will alleviate their suffering. Freud then remarks, it is astonishing that in spite of their pain and their hope for relief, people still can't follow the simple instruction. They resist. They just can't say everything, not without their analyst's help. While conscious resistances based on embarrassment or shame are understandable, Freud discovered there are also unconscious resistances. But even things that are not repressed or suppressed cannot be said when analysands lack vocabulary or awareness. Let me illustrate what I mean with an old joke. Two young fish are swimming together, enjoying their conversation, when an old fish passes them going the opposite direction. The old fish says to the young fish, "Good morning, boys. Isn't the water fine today?" After the old fish had passed, one of the young fish turns to the other and asks, "What's water?" The young fish could not talk about water because he lacked not just the word water, but even awareness that he lived in water. That fish's silence about water, if he were in psychoanalysis, would be a resistance, not an unconscious one, a resistance of ignorance. Perhaps if the old fish had educated the young fish would have been happy to talk about water, but many resistances aren't limited to factual ignorance. The inability to talk about something is often based in a reluctance to acknowledge a feeling. That is, the resistance is unconscious. Martin Bergman quoted a letter from Schopenhauer to Goethe. This is a quote from Bergman, or a quote from Schopenhauer. Sophocles' Oedipus seeks enlightenment concerning his fate and pursues it relentlessly. But most of us carry in our hearts Jocasta, who begs Oedipus to stop looking. Or in the more down-to-earth words of the novelist John Barth in Giles Goatboy, self-knowledge is generally bad news. We keep the bad news unconscious to protect ourselves from pain. When a psychoanalyst talks, it should be to ease the process of making what had been unconscious conscious. If an analyst tells their analysand even the most brilliant and truthful thing about their unconscious before they're ready to hear it, the analysand might feel attacked and vulnerable. Freud introduced joining techniques, or what Jack Kerman calls agreeing with the analysand, to help people in analysis feel comfortable enough to keep talking. When I trained in the 1970s, I wasn't taught much beyond Oedipal interpretations, to use only very rarely, and joining to help analysands overcome resistances. And often Oedipal interpretations, joining, or just attentive listening, are enough. And an analysand will develop the ego strength to allow painful stuff to emerge from their unconscious without further intervention. In my experience, however, a lot of people need a little more help. In my practice, I still use joining to help resolve resistances. I also use Oedipal interpretations. What I want to demonstrate in this webinar this evening is an additional tool that I've developed over the last 50 years to overcome resistances. I call it the narrative metaphor, or simply storytelling. Well, I suspect that many analysts tell stories as I do. No analyst seems to have written about it, perhaps because Freud's infatuation with Oedipus inhibited people from writing honestly about how they tell other stories other than Oedipus' story. Without a tradition of psychoanalytic storytelling, the bibliography for this webinar is very short and is limited to the importance of finding the right story in general, rather than anything specific to analysis. Just three things, three items. The first three chapters of the book of Genesis, in the first three chapters of the book of Genesis, Adam is given power by God over all the plants and animals, and then is tasked with naming all the plants and animals, quoting from the Bible, in order that he might have dominion over them. The names give dominion. George Orwell's essay on Newspeak in 1984 develops the biblical insight, without giving the Bible credit, to explain that we can't have a thought for which we lack vocabulary. Finally, Barbara Smith recently recommended a wonderful paper to me by Ella Freeman Sharp, Psychophysical Problems Revealed in Language, that focuses on understanding unconscious symbols embedded in stories told by analysands. I find Freeman Sharp's paper useful in thinking about how I want to word the stories I tell to make the greatest impact. Let me begin my discussion of storytelling with the first psychoanalytic story, that of Oedipus. What occurs to me is that Freud's reading of the Oedipal myth in the context of a psychoanalysis is a story that describes a universal phenomenon of a young child's management of its relationship with both its primary caretaker, typically the mother, its growing awareness that mother is interested in other people, especially a father, and the ensuing jealousy of its rivals for mother's attention. In other words, Freud used Oedipus' story as a metaphor, but for his most devout followers, Oedipus became the only story, and any other story is what they call a parameter, which, while sometimes unavoidable, is always a little regrettable. I have a different take on it. While the Oedipus story is a good one, it isn't the only story, nor is it necessarily the best story to help an analysand talk. Just as analysands sometimes need help finding the words to say everything, I need a new vocabulary to explain myself to you. For many years, my friend Alan McLeod and I have been on a quixotic campaign to introduce the word emotion as a verb, parallel to reason being both a verb and a noun. All analysts know we can't reason people out of what they've been emotioned into. They can only be emotioned, or better yet, emotion themselves out of their repetition compulsions. What I believe happens when I introduce a narrative is that my stories give the analysand a vocabulary and a narrative framework with which to tell me their stories, that is, a path to emotion themselves into change. What I do in my work is suggest to people in analysis with me whatever story seems to address what they're struggling to talk about. Often my story is an elaboration of the story the analysts themselves tells me, using a lot of the analysand's own words. The analysand's don't start, not the analysts don't start. Using a lot of the analysand's own words, in effect joining. But sometimes the analysand struggles to articulate something. And sometimes I'm aware of something that the analysand is not quite conscious of. It is in those contexts that I feel it appropriate to say something. And very often what I introduce are new vocabulary or a story or a metaphor. I arrive at my choice of story by my own free associations as I listen to what the analysand says and doesn't say by paying attention to what I'm feeling as the analysand is talking. When a story pops into my mind, I think about how the analysand might respond, and if I think it'll be helpful, tell it. Let me offer a few examples. Some of you participated in the IMPP webinar I conducted last year on charisma. Perhaps you remember the story I told of Mr. A former politician. Many of the policies he liked had been adopted into law. But these ideas were not original with him, nor was he uniquely instrumental in their becoming official policy. Other ideas that he had enthusiastically endorsed, imaginative and practical solutions to long-standing social problems, failed to become policy. He came to believe that his support of a new idea virtually guaranteed that it would be ignored, postponed, mocked, or rejected. I suggested we call this his Cassandra complex, after the story of the Trojan princess who, when she refused Apollo's sexual advances, was punished with both the gift of prophecy and the curse that no one would ever believe her. Mr. A strongly identified with Cassandra's story and used it to elaborate on many things he had previously not been conscious of. Well, I can't tell you my exact process of arriving at Cassandra's story. I do remember my frustration and boredom with hearing Mr. A repeat over and over his own frustration with having his good solutions to pressing social problems constantly rejected. And I began to suspect that I felt a little like Mr. A's constituents who rejected his leadership and wisdom. And this in spite of the fact that his ideas appealed to me intellectually. At some point, I realized that Mr. A was Cassandra. Another example, many years ago, I worked with a young man referred to me by an acquaintance who worked in a hospital emergency room. The man had gone to the ER because during a panic attack, he had felt his body going rigid and he thought he was having a heart attack. As there was nothing physically wrong with him, my acquaintance recommended that he see me. As I listened to the man struggle to find a way to tell me his story in words, and he'd already told me his story in action with all the difficulty he had made in scheduling our first session, process that went on for weeks, I found myself getting uncharacteristically annoyed with him and his idealization of what he saw as his strength in sticking with whatever course he was on. In thinking about my countertransference, an Aesop fable came to mind. Although it was our first session, he had already made it clear during our long struggle to find a mutually convenient time for our first session that he was religiously observant, and I suspected predisposed to accept parables. I told him the following story. A young willow tree shared a riverbank with an ancient oak. The oak gave the willow sapling friendly advice. Sometimes a strong wind blows, the old oak said, and then it's wise to do as I've always done and stand firm against the storm. Sometime later, there was a great storm, and the willow sapling tried to follow the oak's advice, but failed and found himself bent almost flat to the ground. When the storm was over, the willow sprang back to his upright position. But the oak had been blown over and killed. During the many years this man and I worked together, He returned to the story over and over. The story helped him feel understood, and as we worked together, gave him a narrative framework and a vocabulary with which to describe both his lifelong idealization of rigidity and his new goal of learning to bend and flex with the vicissitudes of life. Or to translate into psychoanalysis, Aesop's story helped make dystonic what had been syntonic. As he became more and more flexible, my analysand became braver and braver in exploring the darkest recesses of his soul. And I found myself, to my surprise, really liking him and enjoying our work together. Another man came to me with a history of being fired from one job after another, always following the same patterns. Things would begin well enough, and then something would go wrong. Typically, the business would experience a downturn. While the business's problems were not clearly related to how my analysand did his work, which I believe was objectively good enough, his coworkers would go to the boss and ask that if anybody would let go, it would be my analysand. He was fired from yet another job about a year into our work together. My problem with this man was in some ways the opposite of my problem with the rigid oak guy. I liked this guy and had no induced desire to get rid of him because he hadn't brought his repeated rejections into the transference, or his repeated rejectability into the transference might be more accurate. I was stuck until I thought to tell him a story about someone who had also been rejected by his colleagues. I read the book of Jonah to him. Very briefly, for those of you who have forgotten how the story begins, I'm paraphrasing, God commands Jonah to go to Nineveh, that great city, to warn the people there to mend their wicked ways. Jonah does not want the commission and tries to run away by getting on a boat about to leave in the opposite direction. There's a great storm, and the sailors, knowing that the storm had been caused by God to show his displeasure with someone on the boat, cast lots to discover the culprit. When the sailors learn it is Jonah, they throw him overboard, and you know the rest of the story. My analysand story paralleled Jonah's in some important ways, but not in others. While I could not see what important mission he was shirking, he did. He began talking about things he'd never talked about before, including how he had chosen his profession, the other profession he had dreamed of following but lacked the courage to pursue, the pressure he felt first from his mother and later his wife to stay with the profession he hated, his anger about feeling trapped, and so forth. He became aware of shirking the responsibility he felt to himself. For years afterwards, Jonah remained a major frame of reference for him and a guide for making important decisions. Not all the narrative metaphors I suggest are so clearly narrative or metaphoric. After another analysand complained for the first half hour of her session about the many little life annoyances she had had to deal with that morning, she got caught in the rain with an umbrella that turned inside out, a bus that pulled away just as she approached the bus stop, a long and slow-moving line at her usual coffee shop. I told her my induced feeling was to take her out for an ice cream cone. It's clear I wasn't going to actually do that, only that as she talked, that's what I wanted to do. Years later, she told me that the ice cream cone intervention was a turning point in her treatment. She referred to what she called your, meaning mine, ice cream fantasy, and used it to expand on her yearning to return to a lost intimacy with her nurturing parents and her disappointment with the people in her adult life who failed to understand what she craved. Sometimes all I have to do is suggest vocabulary without a story. One evening last week, as I was preparing those remarks, I recalled having told an analysand that morning about Melanie Klein's distinction between envy and jealousy, and as nearly as I could tell, she was jealous, not envious. I told her this after being confused by a story she was telling me. She was clearly enraged, but both the target of her anger and the cause seemed to shift constantly. Following my intervention, she accepted her jealousy, and the story she was telling me became clear both to me, and more importantly, to her. I think this is the final example. Yeah. Another one. M told me he was feeling anxious, a word that children typically don't learn until we're, or at least school age, but he didn't know why he was anxious. I sensed that if he continued to talk about his anxiety, it wouldn't go anywhere because he was reporting intellectually, rationally, rather than emotionally experiencing something with me at that moment. So I told him, M, you aren't anxious. You're scared. My model is a mother speaking to a little child. No mother has ever told her frightened 3-year-old that he was feeling anxious. Adult vocabulary cut M off from his feelings, became a tool of his unconscious resistance. As soon as I told him he was scared, he began to talk, also in simple but accurate words, about what he was frightened of. And by the way, if anybody's curious later during our discussion, I'd be happy to share with you my observation about the unique parallel vocabularies in English. I think it's unique in certainly European languages. We have one vocabulary based on Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and the second based on French and Latin, and how, for the most part, we emotion in Anglo-Saxon and reason in French. And I think communications should be translated into English, French, English, Anglo-Saxon, and French should be put to rest. With other people, I've sung songs very badly, told jokes, I hope better, made references to popular TV shows, and so on. Shared stories are glue in most intimate relationships. Two people organically develop private frames of references and private slang, clear to them, but cryptic to anyone else. The narrative metaphor in a psychoanalysis is a little different, however, because it is developed not out of shared experience, but suggested unilaterally and consciously by the analyst to provide the narrative framework that had been missing. Unlike the private jokes of friends or lovers, my stories are not intended to be consciously understood, and unlike more traditional interpretations, they're not intended to be rational or logical. The stories I tell my analysands are communications to their unconscious minds. They're in many ways analogous to jokes, and like a good joke, they lose value if they're explained. I suggest a story and then wait to see what the analysand does with it. If it becomes the stuff of new information from the analysand, I've suggested a useful story. Of course, not all my stories are successful. I think the stories that fail to resolve resistances immediately have been ill-timed. That is, the story might have resolved a resistance had I been more sensitive to clues about when to tell it. I have an abstract idea about how to time interventions in general, not just storytelling, but my scheme is not always accurate. What I look for is a sense that a repressed feeling or memory has moved from the unconscious to preconsciousness, a little like a name or a word somebody is trying to remember that is now just on the tip of the tongue. When I make a successful intervention, the analysand will often say something, oh yes, just as someone might if I were to tell them the name or a word that they couldn't quite remember. Other analysts are undoubtedly better at recognizing this tip of the tongue sensation than I am, and will have a higher success rate with their stories. In a conversation about this paper, Nicole Kerman shared with me her observation that I like very much. When she becomes aware that an analysand is not saying something, then chances are what is not being said has emerged from the person's unconscious to their preconscious. And it's often just about to be verbalized. That is, if Nicole suddenly becomes aware of sex or aggression, she thinks sex or aggression is just about to be verbalized by the analysand. If an analysand then fails to talk about the feeling that has unexpectedly popped into the analyst's mind, then it is time to intervene. While my batting average on telling useful stories is probably not much north of 200, I've also noticed that my misses seem to do no harm. Only twice, both times with people with borderline personality disorder, has an analysand responded to one of my stories as a blow to their necessary ego defenses, like a premature interpretation. And a story that falls flat can have positive consequences. For example, my analysands sometimes experience my useless stories as evidence of my fallibility. That is, they tell me, sometimes with anger and often with glee, that my story makes no sense. This can lead to a litany of my other foibles. In other words, my bad stories can sometimes resolve resistances to articulating negative transference and strengthen my analysand's ego through appropriate discharge of aggression. And there's another thing. Sometimes one of my poorly timed stories will lie dormant, at first an apparent dud, and then months or even years later come back as a rich source of new information. Interestingly, the story is often reactivated by something someone else says to the analysand that mirrors a story that I had been the first to suggest. Why so many analysands prefer to give credit to someone else for a helpful intervention that originated with me is a topic for another webinar on negative transference. My comments this evening have been about resistance and the analyst option to resolve them. Before ending my prepared remarks and opening our webinar to discussion, I want to comment briefly on transference, the twin issues of all psychoanalytic theory, transference and resistance. Many analysts are reluctant to say anything to their analysands other than joining or Oedipal interpretations for fear that their words will somehow dilute the transference. I have two observations. First, we already give away a lot of information about ourselves within the first few minutes of our consultation. Our education is usually documented on our office walls, but an observant person checking us out will also note our gender, age, through our accents, the place where we grew up, our taste in clothing, office decor, our ethnic origins, and so forth. In other words, the idea of being a totally blank screen is a bit of a delusion. In the same vein, silence or an Oedipal interpretation or joining in the face of resistance are no less self-revealing than telling a story. I believe that the real blank screen that might be maintained is the analyst's emotions. And even there, as when I told an analysand my induced desire to buy her an ice cream cone, there are exceptions. I've not found my stories to have been an impediment to my analysand's transferences. Transference provides the matrix to turn analytic sessions into emotional rather than intellectual experiences. Often it takes the right story to make that happen. I now invite participants to comment, perhaps to speculate about why a story can help resolve resistance if they find any merit in my technique, or to suggest why providing narrative metaphors might be a bad idea if you disagree. And perhaps what I have said resonates with your own practice, and you can tell us all of a story you told in analysand that resolved a resistance and how you arrived at that story. Most of all, I hope that some of the participants will tell us about an analysand's resistance to see if I or any of the other webinar participants this evening can think of a story that might help the person say new things. Okay. That's it. Now, if this were an analytic session, I'd be asking myself, why does nobody want to say anything? And my unconscious, I'd be hoping that something would emerge from my unconscious, a story that would help people begin to ask questions or make comments.
I'm waiting for you to tell us a story.
I'm waiting for one to pop into my unconscious.
I very much appreciate everything that you've talked about tonight. This is very, very liberating for me because I ask my patients what movies they see. I'm very visually oriented and who they relate to and what have you, and have them go along those lines. And I feel it very effective. And they feel liberated. Oh, I can talk about that. Yeah, I want you to talk about that. And I also asked them to talk about their favorite fairy tales and stories from childhood and mythologies, and it appeals to the Jungian in me because we talk about superheroes and
that's all great. And movies, I find, are a particularly rich source of story. Particularly, I love movies, and a couple of weeks ago, I have a favorite movie. It's people don't watch it much anymore. The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. I don't know if you know it. It's about a 60-year-old movie. It was one of it was either Tom Courtenay's first movie or second movie. He's one of my favorite English actors. I'm not going to tell the story because it's acontextual. But I told a story in that how this very talented long distance runner throws a race. Just he's able to easily win, and he stops 100 yards short of the finish line and lets the second guy pass. And why he did that? And it was just the right story. It just opened a floodgate from the person I told it to. So I don't know why a story isn't occurring to me now, but well, I guess I do know why. With an analysis, I have many weeks to listen to the resistance over and over again. And sometimes after I've heard the resistance for the 10th time or the 100th time, finally my unconscious relaxes and the story emerges. And I just don't have time this evening, or haven't had time yet, to find the right story.
One aspect of this it strikes me really as communicating recognition and understanding. That I did something like this with a patient. He was talking for a while about he grew up in Mississippi, and he was talking about his father and how his father liked hunting and all this other stuff, and he liked music, and he liked computers, and he liked sitting in his room. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with with the cartoon King of the Hill. Hank Hill has he has friends, and it takes place in the South in Texas. But Bobby Hill, his son, is very different from Hank. And Hank just says, well, that boy ain't right. And I made the similar remark, and his hand went up and he said, that's exactly it.
And that's it. That's a wonderful example of the thing I'm talking about. It person feels recognized, they feel understood, and it enables them to tell their story in a richer way and move beyond that. If people continue in their analysis to only tell the stories that they're already aware of and are comfortable telling, and that's not an analysis. It's this notion of resistance to telling the story that either first the conscious resistance is about stuff you're embarrassed to talk about. But then as you talk, stuff just starts to ooze out of the unconscious. And where did that come from? Suddenly I'm having a feeling that I've never had before. And sometimes just that kind of a label. Another example from just this week, the father of somebody I'm working with died, and the person I'm working with gave a eulogy for his father. And I have to give a name, so I'll call him John Doe. That's obviously not his real name. He was in a church, and he said, I hope this isn't blasphemy. But until I was 6 years old, he told his story. I thought my name was Jesus Christ John Doe, because that's how my father always addressed me. And he told me that story. John Doe told me that story several years ago in his analysis. And that framed his relationship with his father. And that was a recovered memory. That was not something he did not, when he started his analysis, he didn't remember that his name was Jesus Christ John Doe. That only came up after a while. He said, where did that come from? But that was it. And he checked with his mother, and he said that your father always said, Jesus Christ, John Doe, how come you did it that way? Jesus Christ, John Doe, can't you remember anything? So you're introducing that story, then becomes part of the narrative.
Mm.
Everybody paid for an hour and a half, and I only prepared 30 minutes of talk. I should have prepared more, give you your money's worth.
I was curious about what kinds of songs you have sung to patients.
Oh, all kinds of songs. I don't remember the first one I remember. Also from the last month or so. I'm going to start with an aside. I'm going to go back a little bit. One of the things that started me to think about the limits of the Oedipal story, Freud thought it was the universal problem, the universal origin of all neurosis was people's failure to deal with the Oedipal problem. And I don't think it is. I think it's a source of, I think everybody goes through it. I think it's a source of a great deal of many emotional problems. But I think even more primal than the Oedipal story is everybody's resistance to being aware of their own mortality. And I've thought that for many years. And one of the things I listen for what people are not talking about is their own mortality. And I find as I get old, I've been an analyst for over 50 years, so I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but you can figure it out. I'm not a youngster. Periodically, I will ask somebody who's never alluded to the fact that I'm an old man, how come they've never talked about how old I am and the fact that I might die before we finish our work together? Bring it into the transference, bring it in an emotional way. I find that very, very worthwhile. But one person I'm dealing with who is dealing with his own mortality and dealing with what it means to be really dead. In 100 years' time, he won't be remembered, and how he wished he had done something to be remembered by. I told him about Harry Lawton. I wonder if I don't know how many people are out there. Can anybody here tell me who Harry Lawton was? Before the First World War, he was the most famous vaudevillian in the English-speaking world. He was a Scotsman, song and dance man, and a comedian. And he was the highest paid, most famous person in the world. And this is before television or radio, or even movies, certainly before talking movies. So he was known. And nobody knows him anymore. And for this person, I suppose I should put put it in the context. This person is dealing with his own mortality. Is retired now, but had been a professional musician all his life. Music was really central to his life, and composer. He's written many songs. And I sang him a Harry Lawton song. I wanted to make it. I didn't want to just give him the intellectual fact that Harry Lawton was the most famous person, most famous entertainer in the English-speaking world before the First World War. I wanted to bring him into Harry Lawton's world. And so I sang a comic song from Harry Lawton, which I'm not going to sing for you, unless you absolutely beg me, but you'll regret it, I promise you. I think I could earn a pretty good living by allowing people free admission into an auditorium and then singing for them and charging admission for them to leave. But my singing this song was, I think it worked. It really started this guy talk. He sang some of the songs he then had written. Some of them were great, and I never heard them. And his regrets that his songs had not become better known. He earned a living as a musician. He was a very successful musician. But he started talking about other things, the urge to build, the urge to become famous, the vanity of it, the urge to build pyramids, so on. It was a productive intervention.
So if I could jump in with a little story of my own.
Please.
There's somebody here in this group I haven't seen for a while. The first modern analyst that I ever met online and doing logs for a reading program, and how tight I was with being able to write or even talk to her either by phone or Zoom, and just it was so difficult for me. And at one point in an email, she just encouraged me, saying, "It's okay, Rapunzel, you can let down your hair." And I'm just saw her look up here. But I'm also kind of smiling because after all these years, I didn't have this long braid back then, and I do now. And that was a turning point for me in being able to begin writing and talking a little bit more freely.
I'll tell you something uncanny. When I first saw you this evening, and I saw your braid, Rapunzel jumped into my mind.
Uh-huh. So I'm wondering about identifying who that person is, or letting her just be nice and quiet here. So I'm curious if she remembers having done that.
Her picture flashed briefly on the screen as you were talking. I didn't see her name. I'm not going to identify her unless she wants to be identified. But she was smiling and shaking her head, and it looked like she recognized the story.
Mm-hmm.
I assume it was the person you were referring to. So somebody, maybe it wasn't. Somebody was smiling and nodding yes.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a common experience. I was just turning my mic off. Maybe it's a common experience of feeling mute in initial encounters.
I don't remember the context now, but I remember telling somebody years ago the Rapunzel story, and that became an organizing story for that person's analysis. I don't remember the circumstance. I don't remember specifically which person it was. The person who made a comment just a moment ago about fairy tales. But fairy tales are told over and over again because they do resonate. I forget who it was. One of the early analysts thought that the origin, both Abraham and Ferenczi wrote these really interesting speculative articles about all kinds of psychoanalytic applications to things. And I suspect it was one of them. The origin of fairy tales started with dreams, that people, our caveman ancestors, would sit around the campfire in the morning having their morning breakfast, gnawing on mastodon bones or something, and they would tell their dreams. And almost all the dreams would then be forgotten. But every once in a while, somebody would tell a dream that really resonated with other people in the group. And the dream would be told over and over again. And perhaps some idiosyncratic peculiarities in the dream would be sanded down, and that the emotional core of the dream would be polished, and that dream would then be embellished, and it would become a folk story and a fairy tale. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was the early analyst speculation about the origin of fairy tales, and they become very useful stories. Can become the right fairy tale told to the right analysand can become a very useful story.
So I have a question connected with cultures, right? If you're working with someone who is not of your culture, it seems to me that it would be helpful to do some reading in terms of stories from that culture, in terms of working with someone.
Absolutely. Before we began, I was talking with Lisa and Ray about work I've done in China. I'm part of a group that's bringing psychoanalysis to China called the Chinese American Psychoanalytic Association, CAPA. And I've had Chinese patients now. By the way, everybody I've worked with speaks fantastic English. I don't speak any Chinese. Although language becomes an issue, as good as their English is, and I've learned a lot about the structure of Chinese language and Chinese thought in getting clarification when they use what they think is an idiom, or they use an idiom the wrong way. And yeah, I've read a lot, but equally important, I've had them tell me Chinese stories. I was just telling Lisa and Ray that one person I've worked with from China for a long time now has introduced me to one of the great stories of China. According to this person, it's one of the most important of the Chinese fairy tales, called The Monkey King. And a lot of this person's analysis is centered around his identification with the Monkey King and telling the story in different ways. So it cuts both ways. And every Chinese person I've worked with has really seemed to, they get the story that I've told them. Whether it was Abraham or Ferenczi, who had the notion of the universal quality of fairy tales. There are universal things. It's just what metaphor we choose to put it in might be culturally specific.
Okay.
But yeah, no, when working with people from other cultures, not just their stories, but trying to learn as much about it as possible. there's so much we take for granted. The reason I don't know, but it might be relevant to the night's discussion. The reason I got interested in working with Kappa was I wanted to learn more about China. And one of the, and I told this story before we began to Lisa and to Ray. And this actually wasn't in Kappa, it was in New York. I had a supervisory group, and in this, people from all over the world. It was just one of those coincidences. And somebody sneezed, and somebody said Gesundheit, somebody said salute, and somebody said bless you. But there was at least one, I think 2 Koreans and a Chinese person, and the East Asians didn't say anything. So and there's also other people that forget that, right? Somebody from Greece, I don't remember now. I said, what do you say in your culture? So people said, their word for when somebody sneezed. But the East Asians said, and they all said the same, we don't say anything. Why would you comment on somebody's bodily function? You don't say anything after somebody coughs. Why do you say it after somebody sneezes?
Good question.
And one person said, and you certainly don't say anything after somebody farts. Why do you comment on that particular bodily function? And raised the question and helped me see it in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And that's one of the things I really love about working with these Chinese people. And so I read in order not to commit a faux pas. If one of them sneezes, I don't say, bless you. Shouldn't call attention to the function. And there's some very good books. You don't have to read. You don't have to get a PhD in Chinese culture. 2 or 3 books are pretty good, enough introduction so that you can begin to work in these different cultures. And I am curious about lots of things. I've always read lots of anthropological studies about all kinds of cultures.
Right.
And when I work with somebody, not just a Chinese person, but if somebody, an American-born person comes in, but the person who commented before who likes to tell fairy tales. If somebody came to me from Mississippi, I've worked with people from Mississippi. I might read novels are a very rich source of information, and I might ask somebody I know who's Southern what novel really captures something from somebody from Mississippi, and read a couple of novels tells the story of the everyday life, or a movie or a series of movies. Fried green tomatoes. It comes to mind. I've never treated anybody from Mississippi, so I haven't had to educate myself that way. But when I have treated people from other walks of life, different kinds of cultural experiences, and I do educate myself.
Thank you.
Well, one thing that nobody's asked me about, and I was curious because I thought people might, is I was very careful not to use the word patient. And the one time I used the word cure, I put it in quotation marks and suggested a better word is help people develop free will. Nobody's asked me about it, but I'm going to tell you why I do that anyway. Psychoanalysis was invented, I don't know, some combination between invented and discovered by Freud, who was a medical doctor. And I think it was almost inevitable that it developed out of medicine because it was treating what were seen as medical problems. And psychoanalysis became, I think, encumbered with an all-encompassing medical metaphor. So people talk about patients, they talk about treating them, they talk about cure. One psychoanalytic theorist, I can't remember her name now, she wrote a lot. And talked about the point of fixation in infancy that would be the point in which the neurosis developed. And she called it the lesion. And she meant it. She took it seriously. I attended a lecture and I asked her questions about it. She literally thought she was talking about a lesion in the nervous system or something. I don't know. Now, clearly, there's a biological basis for what goes on, and I alluded to Freud's 1895 paper. The repetition compulsion is burned into the nervous system as in infancy. But I think the medical metaphor does a misservice or disservice. It narrows the thought that people have and narrows our ability to think about what we do. And I try to avoid it as much as possible. I do not think of the people who see me as my patients. I think of them as the people who see me. Sometimes analysand is an artificial word. I typically don't think of them as analysands in my own mind, but they're just the people I'm working with. And I'm very much concerned with the notion of why they have come to work with me and what they want. And I'm quoting myself now. What psychoanalysis does is help people's troubled souls. And you know, in Freud's original German, the word that's translated as mind, M-I-N-D, in English, was the German word Seele, S-E-E-L-E, which is the German word for soul. And I do not speak German, so I apologize if I did not pronounce that very well. But I learned about this from a wonderful book by Bruno Bettelheim called Freud and Man's Soul. It's a book I highly recommend about Freud's language. But that was one of the few times when Freud did not use a medical metaphor. Most other times, Freud was really steeped in the medical metaphor. So anyway, that's an aside.
I'd like to ask a question.
Please.
You began your talk this evening saying that you were going to discuss technique, not theory.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could spend, since we have time, I wonder if you could spend a few minutes talking about theory and particularly what Freud or specifically Hyman Spotniks would think of this approach. I'm probably one of the few non-analysts in this meeting tonight, and I've taken a number of modern classes through Philadelphia and also New York. And what I'm most impressed about modern psychoanalysis is this notion of joining and mirroring. And it would seem to me, in my naivete, it would seem to me that suggesting a story to those who come to see you would disturb the process of joining and mirroring. And I just wonder if you could address that from a theoretical standpoint.
It's interesting. You've asked actually about 6 different questions. I don't know if I can weave them all together into a coherent answer. First of all, in terms of Freud, I hope it came across in my talk. I'm a great admirer of Freud. I admire in particular, though, Freud's questions more than his answers. I think Freud asked brilliant and original questions and questions that are universal. And the main question that Freud asked is what happens to frustrated desire? And I think most Freudian theory follows from that question. A lot of Freud's answers are still relevant and good and useful, but a lot of them aren't. And one of the ways in which I think Freud led himself astray is he fell in love with some of his answers. And I think he should have stayed focused on his question. One of his answers, and it's actually not exactly an answer, but it's more in the answer column than the question, is the Oedipal story. Freud thought his discovery of the universal Oedipal experience would go down in the annals of science, along with Newton's formulation of mathematical basis of gravity, all the other Copernicus's formulation of the heliocentric universe, all the great scientific discoveries. I think in this regard, Freud was self-deluded. As I said, I think it is a universal experience that every child goes through, this kind of triangulation of the struggle of sharing mother with the world, going from this exclusive dyad, all-absorbing dyad with mother, to share, or whoever the principal nurturing person is, to sharing mother with the world. And that has important, major impact on how we develop. But it's not the only story. And I think if Freud were in the audience tonight, I think he'd be furious at me for, well, he would just, he could be very dismissive, very contemptuous. He'd give me the back of his hand and he'd just say, that's nonsense. Oh, I can give you a specific example of that with the Oedipus story. In the early days of psychoanalysis, the early people who were getting interested in it met, I think, on Wednesday evenings in Freud's apartment and discussed psychoanalytic theory. This is in the 1890s, very early. Among those who met in Freud's apartment, one of them was a man named Alfred Adler. Adler went on to write some really interesting stuff, particularly stuff on aggression. That he saw lots of stuff, I think, about aggression that Freud did not. Freud hinted at. Some of Freud's works parallel it, but I think Adler is clearer on aggression than Freud was. But one of the things that that Adler came up with, that Freud rejected adamantly, was sibling rivalry. It's part of everyday speech. Everybody knows about sibling rivalry. That phrase originated with Alfred Adler. Freud rejected it, I think, on ridiculous grounds. Freud said there's no such thing as sibling rivalry. All apparent sibling rivalry is only a displaced Oedipal rivalry. It's only displaced Oedipal conflict. You're displacing your competition with dad onto your siblings. There might be something to that, but it's just nonsense. So in terms of theoretically what Freud might say about my theoretical presentation, and I think it would be something along those lines. I'm less enamored of Spotnitz. I learned a couple of things from Spotnitz. I think I might have learned from other people. Spotnitz did not have a monopoly on focusing on what the analysand says, but he's the guy I learned it from, so I give him credit. And the other big thing I learned from Spotnitz, this doesn't quite address your question, but I want to be fair to Spotnitz. He said something to me once. I said in my introductory remarks that Spotnitz, I didn't learn much from him. And I kept trying to say, Spotnitz, Dr. Spotnitz, how did you learn this? How did you know to do this? Yeah. And he told me a story at one point. He said, he told me, I'm now almost quoting, he said, the difference between me and every other analyst I've ever met, Spotnitz said about himself, is that unlike them, they all set out to become psychoanalysts when they went into training. And I went into psychoanalytic training to learn how to help people. And I love that. And I've always kept that as a kind of a mantra. And when I talk to other psychoanalysts and tell them honestly how I practice, and many of them will tell me, oh, you're not a real psychoanalyst, I almost wear that as a badge of honor. I don't care whether people think I'm a psychoanalyst or not. I want to find a way to help people. And I think what helps people was Freud's initial speculation from 1895, is that if you talk enough in the right way, in the transference, that is in an emotional context, not intellectually reporting. In the context of this special relationship in the analysis, stuff will come out of your unconscious. What had been unconscious will become conscious, and you change. To me, all other theory is just commentary on that. And that doesn't exactly address your question, but I don't really know what else to say. Would you like more about that?
No, I appreciate your struggle with my question. Perhaps my lack of training.
No, it's a very good question because it's a good question because it gave me an opportunity to say things that I wanted to say.
Sure.
So I appreciate that. So thank you.
No, I was my own understanding of Spotnik's from my reading is that he went into training because he was addressing a gap that Freud gave up on certain patients, and Spotnik's wanted to address those people. And it was the people who actually struggled with the inability to narrate their experience. So the three of you are addressing the same dilemma from a very different standpoint.
That isn't quite an accurate story about Spotnik.
Okay.
Spotnik went in to train as a conventional analyst. While he was in training, he started to treat people using analytic techniques that he not yet developed any of the stuff that we now think of as Spotnikian. And he tried interpretation, it wasn't working, and he tried experimenting with other things. But what he did, he continued to call analysis. And he was in training to the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, which at the time, it's since changed. It's not as rigid as it used to be, but it was incredibly rigid and very unimaginative, almost mechanical in their application. This is in the 1930s. And they told Spotnik he could not continue to work with people and call it analysis, working with these kinds of people. And so I don't know whether he left or he was expelled. They came to a mutual agreement that New York Psychoanalytic wasn't for him. And he left. And he never attended another psychoanalytic institute. He was never certified by a psychoanalytic institute. But he continued in his own personal analysis. In fact, I think he had two analysts. First, he told me their names. First was a woman he was in analysis with for years. Not a famous woman. I only heard her name from him. And I think he did a second analysis with somebody else. I'm not sure about that. And Spotnik's really a smart guy. I'm not taking anything away from him. And he came up with these ways of working with these people for whom classical analysis didn't work. And what he realized is it didn't work because their resistances stemmed not from the Oedipal phase of development, this three-party thing, mom, dad, and baby, but from the pre-Oedipal dyad of just mom and baby. And his techniques were designed to deal with resistances that stemmed from that period of development.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your talk and all that has provoked. I appreciate it.
And you asked for theory, my theory. My storytelling technique works equally well with both Oedipal resistances, that is, people who are well into the Oedipal stage of development, and pre-Oedipal resistances. It's not specific to one or the other. If you have the right story. Not the story might involve dyads or triads, and that might be the distinction between what's the right story. You might have to tell a dyadic story to somebody who's pre-Oedipal, and a triadic story as a three-party story to somebody who's Oedipal. I don't know. I haven't thought that through theoretically.
Well, it would seem to fit theoretically in one sense. I mean, in terms of syntonic and dystonic sensibilities. I'm not talking about necessarily joins here, but I mean, in terms of being recognized, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. But then at some point, the story may no longer apply, may no longer fit.
That's true. Stories can become obsolete. And some stories are good only for one session.
Mhm.
It isn't that becomes a theme for the entire analysis. I'll tell you a story about syntonic and dystonic. Teaching, that's not exactly a story, a way of illustrating what those words mean. I found that student analysts early in their training, syntonic and dystonic aren't everyday English. I don't know if the words even exist outside of analytic theory. They might. I've never heard it outside of an analytic context. And to illustrate it and to make them clear, what I describe is me as a child. I lived about a mile from my school, and there was a carpool, and I'd go out, and we were the closest to the school. Some kids lived as far as 2 miles from the school. My sister and I were always the last to be picked up. And I get in the car, and the girl who was the first to be picked up, who lived the furthest from school, would always say, "Richard, you had eggs for breakfast this morning." Or, "Richard, you had grape jelly on your toast this morning." Or, "Richard, you had cocoa for breakfast this morning." She said that because it was all over my face. My dirty face was totally syntonic. I didn't know I had a dirty face. As soon, her name was Tony, a lovely girl. As soon as Tony told me that I had a dirty face, it was then dystonic. If somebody held a mirror up to me, it also would have been. And that's where Spotnitz's mirroring techniques are so valuable. You hold up a mirror and you can see the schmutz on your face. The timing of this, though, is important. As an 8-year-old kid, I couldn't care less whether I had a dirty face or not, and I didn't do anything about it. When I got to school, I didn't rush to wash my face. Yeah, the hell with it. What do I care? But it was useful information if I did care. And if Tony's timing had been correct, not only would I have welcomed her telling me that, at the first opportunity, I would have washed my face. Now, if I had been a more sensitive child, vainer or more easily embarrassed over something like schmutz, if Tony had said, "Richard, you had soft-boiled eggs for breakfast this morning, fried eggs for breakfast this morning," I would have gone, "Oh!" It would have been, it would have been a narcissistic blow. Oh my God, I have to go around like this all day. I have to understand. And I think that is a model for a psychoanalytic intervention. When you're helping something, an analysand become aware of something, they, first of all, have to want that intervention. They have to be willing to accept that knowledge that they have schmutz on their face. And then, and this is where free will comes in, and this is where change comes in, they then have a choice of what they do about it. You mean that's how other people perceive me? You mean the consequences of that particular kind of behavior is this? The reason people do that to me is because I do that? Well, I have a choice. I'm not going to do that anymore. Oh, and that's something else. Another idea that I thought people might ask about, but nobody did. And that was my introduction of the idea of free will. I never took a psychology course as an undergraduate, but my roommate did. And I remember talking about, I was reading Freud. I liked Freud. And I remember discussing Freud with my roommate. And my roommate was not particularly interested in psychology, just took it, and he had no interest in Freud. He became a very distinguished microbiologist and stayed my friend for the rest of his life. But he said, my professor said that Freud believes in predestination. There's no free will. And the reason Freud is all wrong is because Freud didn't believe in predestination. That professor either never read Freud or never gave Freud any thought. That professor gave my roommate wrong information. Freud was the greatest prophet of free will of the 20th century. But he had a very sophisticated view of free will. He thought because our neural pathways are etched into us as babies, and we become stuck in repetition compulsions. In that sense, we don't have free will. But there's a path out. In fact, there's more than one path. There are paths out of repetition compulsion. And the goal of analysis is liberation. It's free will. It's to be free. It's to end the slavery of the repetition compulsion. You can use a whole political metaphor of liberation. And by the way, and Freud himself talked about this in where was it? When he talked about William James's, where he wrote about William James's varieties of religious experience. But I don't remember the essay Freud wrote about this. But there are, through different kinds of religious experience, as anti-organized religion as Freud himself was, there are many different paths, meditation. There's many different ways to liberate yourself from the repetition compulsion. Psychoanalysis being only one.
Well, and a narrative metaphor like Cassandra, the analysand has an opportunity to say, how am I like Cassandra? And I don't want to be like Cassandra. How do I be different in the world?
Exactly. Although that particular example, and that goes back to my talk last year, my analysand had been a politician and wanted to be an effective politician. He was an effective politician. He knew how to play the game and get stuff done. But his own original ideas, he particularly had ideas on prison reform that would significantly lessen recidivism. I think some of the stuff was really brilliant. Nobody wanted, they just wanted to punish prisoners, which doesn't work. The societal repetition compulsion is punish the criminal, take away their free education, and take away privilege. And he wanted to be listened to. And I don't know I have the answer to that. That was my theme last year when I talked about charisma, is why are some people listened to and other people who said the same thing not listened to? And my analysand was not charismatic, and I think all the analysis in the world wasn't going to make him charismatic. But you're right. At least it helped him understand. Understand his position in the world. Mm-hmm. A little bit like I alluded to my singing. A little bit like my piano teacher telling me after the second year of piano lesson, actually didn't tell me, told my mother, "Stop wasting your money." This kid has no musical ability whatsoever. Knowing that and having it confirmed didn't make me musical, but at least helped me accept my lack of musical talent and live with it. Other dystonic discoveries do become instruments of change. You mean if, I'll give you an actual example. I worked with a guy who, a complicated organization, he was very ambitious. And there was a fairly rapid turnover for the manager of his division. And he wanted to become the next manager. He'd been passed over 2 or 3 times. And he was competent. I think he would have been good. He went to work in t-shirts and shorts and sandals. And I said, why do you dress that way? I asked him about it. And he said, well, I'm comfortable, and everybody else on my level dresses that way. And I asked, how does the manager dress? And he said, in a tie and jacket. I didn't say anything more. I didn't have like a good joke. You don't have to explain it. But he started dressing in a tie and jacket, and he got when the manager left, he got the next promotion. That's a very superficial example, but we're out of time, and I needed a quick one. His syntonic way of dressing became dystonic, and he then had the free will to change with positive results.
This is about time, but just wondering if there are any other questions or observations for Dr. Friedman. Well, this has been delightful and inspiring. Thank you so much for talking with us tonight and for all the fascinating stories. I was mesmerized.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I enjoyed it very much. And this is the second time I've done this through IMPP, and I'm grateful to you. It's been great.
Absolutely. So we'll have the recording available to everyone within the next week, and we'll have an evaluation out to you soon to complete for CEs. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Good night.